Our speaker here this evening is a great friend of the museum. Mike Tougias has been here and spoken with us many times before, and there's a real reason for that. Not only is he a great speaker and a very likable guy, but he's also a great storyteller. He's written 24 books, many of them with maritime themes, including The Rescue of the Bounty, The Finest Hours, and A Storm Too Soon. Mike's books are stories of the sea that, in my opinion, really embody what the Mariners Museum is all about. Many of you all know that we've recently sort of updated our mission statement. We say that the Mariners Museum connects people to the world's waterways because that's how we're connected to each other. And Mike's stories, I think, really illustrate that connection better than most. His stories are ones about human beings' love for the sea, but also about how tenuous our connections are, how life and death really comes into focus when you're out there on the water. Most of us have never actually been shipwrecked. Most of us have never actually had to go out and make a rescue in the middle of the ocean while German U-boats are patrolling and trying to kill us. But we all have worried about our loved ones when they're in trouble. We've all had experiences where we've had to stretch ourselves a little farther than we're comfortable doing. We've all felt small when we're standing next to the ocean, watching waves crash and thunder rolling. We've all marveled and wondered about what's down below the surface of the ocean, and his stories connect us to that in ways that are really special and really exciting. They're universal human stories, and they're told by a master storyteller. So please give a warm welcome to Mike Tougias.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be back. Mark kind of hit the nail on the head. My books always zero in on a particular individual involved, and in this case was so close to home. The main character is little Sonny Downs, an 8-year-old boy who was on the ship that was torpedoed. But we also talk about the German perspective, because the German U-boat commander that sank the Heredia that Sonny was on, we were able to locate his U-boat War Diary. So having his diary opened up a whole different perspective. So you see it, from both views. And, just briefly, I try to keep that theme with zero in on one character, but in a bigger historical context. And my upcoming book, which Allison's going to send around a sign-up sheet for my annual newsletter, is about the U-2 pilots who flew over Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people like myself thought, okay, Kennedy resolved that crisis without loss of life. But one pilot, Major Rudy Anderson, he's flying in a U-2, which go 13 miles high. He's taken down by a surface-to-air missile shot by the Soviets in Cuba. And the book follows his story, and it also follows the story of another U-2 pilot who's still alive and well down in Florida. We just got back from spending a few days interviewing him, Jerry McElmore. He's now 87 years old, and he has quite a story to tell because he had the flight the day before Rudy was shot down, and Jerry was shot at. He said in these U-2s, he said, you think they're these big, elaborate, technologically advanced aircraft, but he said, we flew with a rear view mirror. And he said, in the rear view mirror, all of a sudden, I see a contrail and then a starburst right behind my plane. And he said, so I immediately tried to bank it. It's a slow bank. These are like big gliders. And he said, then another one came up. And he said, I managed to get it all on film. And then I'll just jump ahead in the story a little bit. He said a day later, after I told the other pilots what happened to me and, that they're actually firing on us, he said a 3-star general comes down from Washington, and Jerry's going out to the plane the next morning, and the general goes, McElmore. And Jerry walks over, yes, sir. And he goes, you were not fired on. And Jerry goes, sir, I was. I caught it on film. And the general goes, we've developed the film, there's nothing on it, the film has been destroyed. You were not fired on. So it's an interesting story of what was going on in that crisis. And we also had the audio tapes from President Kennedy, who secretly recorded every executive committee meeting. So over 50 hours of audio tape of how they're making the decisions to try and get through this Cuban Missile Crisis without launching nuclear warfare. So it's quite a story. So that's what this sign-up sheet going around. Every, usually September, I issue a newsletter. But getting back to tonight's story, Allison, who's here with me tonight, Allison was the co-author and co-researcher, and we divided the book into 3 parts. And I did the presentation the same way. So part 1 is a little bit about the background of these people involved. And there's Sonny, 8-year-old Sonny. He's the one who's now 87, could not have done the book without him. And his 11-year-old sister, Lucille. His parents, Ray and Ina. And what had happened was they had taken a job in South America to kind of lift themselves out of poverty. And it was Ray's first really good job. He was a railroad locomotive mechanic for the United Fruit Company. And World War II broke out, December 1941, and he says, I want my family back in the U.S., I'm going to join the Marines. But they don't get passage until May of 1942. But that gives you a little background of why they were in South America. They were heading back to their home in San Antonio, Texas. And this is the ship that they finally got passage on, the Heredia. And Mark showed Allison and I 2 beautiful pieces of artwork that came from this ship before it was part of the United Fruit Company, because prior to that, it was a passenger liner. And later, you may want to walk in the front and see these beautiful exhibits. But by this time, it was an older vessel, and it was used to transport bananas and coffee. And most of the passengers on it, when they were coming back in the month of May 1942, were merchant marines and United Fruit employees, only a few civilians, a total of 8, 4 of which were the Downs family. So Sonny, Lucille, Ina, and Ray, those are the ones you're going to see the events through their eyes. They don't know it, but at the very moment they're leaving Colombia, the first 2 U-boats are entering the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when Allison and I started writing the books, we thought U-boats only had the fuel to come to the East Coast, do a quick patrol, and get back to occupied France. We had no idea that the larger U-boats, the Class 9, had enough fuel to go all the way into the Gulf of Mexico, do a 2-week patrol, and get all the way back without being refueled. And if they needed to do a longer patrol, they could secretly rendezvous with something called a milk cow, which was a similar U-boat, but it only carried fuel and extra torpedoes. So if they wanted to, they could have stayed 2 months. But in this case, the first 2 U-boats that came in stayed for 2 weeks. And, if you find yourself out in Chicago, go to the Museum of Science because they have U-505 there. And you go inside, it appears like it's spacious in this picture, but it's not. You'll get the most claustrophobic feeling. They would have 55 German sailors on this one U-boat, with just one head, by the way. So you can imagine what that was like. And then the heat and humidity when they went into the Gulf of Mexico, just overwhelming. But Chicago, I went into it, and it was mind-blowing. And I wondered, how did these men do 6, 7, 8-week patrols in this confined space? So 505 that you see in this picture was the sister ship to the U-boat that we follow in our book. Ours was U-boat 506. And it was commanded by Verdun Man, who was only 28 years old. And it was Verdun Minh's War Diary that made him come to life. You know, when we started this project, we never dreamed we'd find his war diary. We thought, well, this will be a story of good versus evil, this family, their survival at sea story. But when you read his war diary, you get a very different perspective. You get inside his decision-making. You get inside some of the hardships. And you actually see the sinking of the Heredia from his viewpoint that he writes about in the war diary. Am I blocking your view, Mark? You're okay? The other U-boat to enter, there was a tag team of 2 U-boats, 506 and 507, and Harry Schatz was the other commander on the second U-boat. And we had to put him in the book because the guy was so darn colorful and dramatic. He went right to the mouth of the Mississippi River. So did Eric Verdun for that matter. And they said, you know, the yellow-colored water is good camouflage. They said, we can't get very deep, but that water will keep us camouflaged. And he had the habit of, if he sank a ship, he would first wait to make sure the ship was sunk, and I'll explain a little of that in a moment, but then he would hang around, and if there were survivors in a lifeboat, he'd surface right next to them, come up from the hatch onto the conning tower, and he'd go, I'm very sorry, but this is war. You have Roosevelt to blame for this. And then he'd give them food, water. We came across an instance where the people on the boat, he gives them a cake from France that they hadn't eaten yet. And these people are stunned that he could speak perfect English, that he was dressed in shorts, had a great tan going. So really interesting. And the German code of conduct for the U-boat men was very different than the Japanese submariners. They would never kill people in the water. They would never strafe people in the water, whereas the Japanese would take full advantage of these helpless victims. So we found his war diary as well. So, you know, we had to put him in the book because he's alongside our main guy, 28-year-old Eric Verdun, but in a separate U-boat. So the war diaries, besides giving their observations and where they are each day and, you know, the more mundane things of what they're doing each day, it talked about the hardships. And in the Gulf of Mexico, they talked about temperatures reaching 120 degrees and how at night they were all desperate to get up and get fresh air. And that was the liability of these U-boats. They did have to come up. And the reason was they were diesel powered on the surface, and it was the diesel engine that would recharge the batteries so that when they submerged, they're running off battery power. And to keep those batteries going, they would have to come up, and they would do that during the nighttime. Daily updates and many suggestions. A couple themes that I would see over and over in the 2 men's diaries is that they couldn't believe how ill-prepared we Americans were. They would say things like, shore lights on as if in peacetime. They would say, can't believe it, the navigational buoys are lit up. That the aircraft patrolling are doing such a terrible job, they fly right over us and don't even see us. We had so much to learn. Miracle the documents survived. We don't quite know how they ended up at the National Archives. An assumption is that the U-boat headquarters was in Lorient, France, so occupied France, on the water, closer to their adversaries. Maybe when that was overrun by the Allies, some of these diaries were left behind, or they got shipped to Germany, and when we overran Germany, eventually got shipped back to the U.S. But the one we found had never been looked at, never been translated, just a real lucky break. And they were part of a bigger operation called Drumbeat Papenschlagg, and their instructions were, don't just go over there and hit military vessels, go over there and sink as many ships as you can. We want to cripple American shipping so they can't resupply Great Britain, which is just about on its knees by now. And of course, they would prize a tanker, for example, an oil tanker, but their instructions were take down any ship of consequence, write down the estimated tonnage, and you're going to be judged on how many tons you were able to sink during your patrol. Look at this bottom bullet. It's really amazing. In the first 4 months, so they come over in January, you go through April, they sink 170 ships patrolled by the U.S. Navy. And guess how many U-boats we sank? 1. Just, again, shows you that we weren't ready. We ignored some of the British advice given to us about this operation, given to us about how to combat the U-boats. So, as one person said, it sounded like a turkey shoot, and I said, exactly. They would fire with impunity and didn't have too much to worry about. The mastermind behind this was Admiral Karl Dönitz. He served in World War I on a U-boat and was actually taken prisoner by the British. And while he's in prison, he's thinking to himself, you know, if I ever get back to Germany and rise up through the ranks, and if there's another war, I'm going to use the U-boats very differently. And so, lo and behold, that's what happens. He's the head of the U-boat operation, later the head of the whole German Navy. And thank God, Adolf Hitler did not always listen to him. The outcome of the war might have been very different, particularly for Great Britain, because Dönitz was saying, we should use every single U-boat for offensive purposes. We shouldn't hold any back. You know, we're doing so well that the count per U-boat is through the roof, but he could see in the future, eventually, the British and the Americans were going to get better, and he wants every U-boat out there. Hitler, on the other hand, wanted to always keep back a percentage, a pretty good percentage of U-boats for defensive purposes, particularly in the North Atlantic and Norway and that area, should, you know, a surprise attack occur there. And, you know, they came to disagree on that, and of course, Hitler got his way, just like he got his way about attacking Russia when they hadn't even won over defeating Great Britain. But we were surprised that even though they didn't see eye to eye, at the end of the war, Hitler's in the bunker before he commits suicide. Who does he appoint as the last Führer of the Third Reich? It was Dönitz. So he had respect for the guy, even though he didn't listen to him. And the U-boats were housed in these pens in Lorient, France. I'd call them bunkers. And it was really fascinating. In Winston Churchill's correspondence from the time, he says, you know, we bombed the hell out of these U-boat pens in Lorient, France, and think we did some real damage to the U-boats. But in Dönitz's memoirs after the war, he says, the RAF bombed the hell out of Lorient and hit our pens and did absolutely no damage to the U-boats because of this reinforced concrete. And this really was a safe haven for them in the first 9 to 12 months of the war. So U-boats returning from America were hailed as heroes. The sailors got extra leave time. There were special trains going direct from Lorient back to Germany. They would get time off. The commanders, if they were successful, would have playing cards made of them, just like we would have playing cards made of baseball stars. They would have it of their U-boat aces. So they were really the toast of Germany because in the early part of the war, they were so darn effective. You know, the movie some of you may have seen years ago, Das Boot, it's very accurate. I watched it recently, and whereas some movies, they take liberties with the story. My movie, The Finest Hours, they certainly did. I still like the movie, don't get me wrong, but they took liberties with the story. But Das Boot stayed really true to the history. And in the early days, lavish parties when they returned to France. So that's how we begin the book, the setup, introducing these main characters, Erich Verdun, the Downes family, a little bit about Admiral Dönitz. And the action begins when Verdun enters the Gulf of Mexico alongside Harrow shots in the two different U-boats. And right away, they're having great hunting, as they called it. They're sinking all manner of ships, oil tankers, freighters, you name it. And eventually, Verdun makes his way right off the mouth of the Mississippi River. And to give you an idea of how successful he is, these are all the ships that he sunk prior to the Heredia, which is our main vessel we're going to talk about. And if I didn't do it, but if I interlaid a map of Harrow Schatz' victims, it would have been just as many. They had a little friendly competition going, and they were, like neck and neck. And, oftentimes they would attack the ships, even in broad daylight, which might sound suicidal because that means the U-boat would be up near the surface and could easily be spotted by a plane. But they knew our planes weren't that effective in sinking U-boats, so they would oftentimes attack right in broad daylight. Later in the war, they would never do that. We had a couple different sea frontier control rooms. One would be the Eastern Sea Frontier, the other one would be the Caribbean and the Gulf Sea Frontier, where the Navy would try and track, okay, where are our ships? Where are the suspected U-boats? How can we organize convoys and aircraft? But in May of 1942, when the Downes are on their ship, none of this is happening in the Gulf of Mexico because the powers that be don't think U-boats can really come into the Gulf of Mexico. Again, don't think they have the fuel. The Liberator became very effective as a U-boat hunter, but in the early days, it was not. And Erich Verdun wrote in his War Diary, he said, we were bombed a couple times with depth charges, but he said they were so far off, we weren't really concerned. He said, obviously we would submerge, but they were dropped way too far to do any damage. And in this picture, it might be hard for you to see, but there's still a couple Germans up there by the conning tower, and although there are these high-tech vessels that under attack, the men would shout, dive, dive, alarm, alarm, and down they would go, but they had an old-fashioned way to speed up that process. Every available man on the U-boat who wasn't involved in a task would run to the bow to add extra weight, and then, that would accelerate their descent. And Verdun said, we were bombed off Florida, and we were bombed again off of the Mississippi River, just 20 miles off the mouth, but no damage done, and we were able to come right back up again once the planes left the scene. Now, Sonny and Lucille, they're on board the Heredia. They have no idea that these U-boats have entered the Gulf of Mexico, nor have their parents. We suspect that the captain, his name was Captain Edwin Colburn from Somerville, Massachusetts, we suspect he had been alerted because although he wasn't allowed to send outgoing radio messages, he could receive incoming. And, by the time they had reached the Gulf of Mexico, these U-boats had already sunk ships, so I'm sure he was warned. And I'm sure Ina and Ray were starting to pick up on the increased surveillance on board the ship and some of the evasive maneuvers taken and just the general mood of the captain. They did have a 6-man Navy gunner crew on board the ship as well. So originally, their path was supposed to take them straight up through the Yukon and to New Orleans. But somebody on board the ship sees something suspicious in the ocean, tells Captain Colburn. He thinks, well, maybe they saw a U-boat in the distance surfacing. So he decides, I'm going to make a beeline to Corpus Christi and be safe. And they get there, and by now Ina's got this feeling that the Germans must be in the Gulf. Why else is everything going so differently in this demeanor of the crew? So she's hoping to disembark there with her family, and she asks the captain, who's going to go ashore on the pilot boat, to get permission for us to exit here. Well, he goes ashore, and he returns, and he says, Mrs. Downs, I'm sorry, but the officials say no one can leave the ship here, and they're even telling us we can't lay anchor here for the night. And so by now, Ina's got a really bad feeling. You know, whether it's a woman's intuition or just her putting these clues together, and she's pleading, just let us off here, and he goes, we can't. And then he says, but don't worry, he said, you know, evening's coming on, by the time you wake up in the morning, we'll be at the dock in New Orleans. And at the same time this is going on, Eric Verdun's path is already taking him to the mouth of the Mississippi River, and the evening that the Heredia is heading that way, he's lying about 30 miles off the Mississippi River in an area called Ship Shoal Buoy. And he sees the Heredia coming from a distance, and in his war diary he says, we don't really need to pursue this ship. Looks like a good size, have to get ourselves in position, we're going to wait for it, and we'll be point blank. So, you know, he described it as a shadow, but it was probably a silhouette with maybe if there were moonlight or stars or whatever. So as the Heredia approaches, the Downs have all gone to bed. Sonny's in the top bunk, his father's in the bottom, Lucille and her mom are in the adjoining cabin. And when the torpedoes hit, Sonny thinks they've actually bumped up against the dock in New Orleans. He thinks it's morning. But his father wakes him, the lights are flickering, and his father goes, put your life jacket on, don't move, I'm getting your mother and sister. Sonny can't put it all together, but then with these flickering lights, he can see that water's already coming into their cabin. And he's scared to death, but his dad comes back, just like he said, with the mom and the sister. The four of them are all holding hands, and they're going up. Again, this ship used to be a passenger ocean liner. They're going up this beautiful mahogany stairway to where the lifeboat is supposed to be. And that's when disaster strikes. Either it's the second torpedo, we're not sure, or so much water has come into the ship, but it suddenly lurches, and a wall of water hits the family as they're at, you know, the last one or two steps before the deck. And the water hits them so hard, it breaks their handhold with each other, and now each individual is on their own. Now, from an author's point of view, that was like an extra bonus, because you have four survival stories. I'm sure the family didn't feel this way. But again, you know, as an author, you're always thinking, is there enough here to sustain a whole book? Because I'm pitched ideas all the time, and 98% of them would make great magazine articles, but could never sustain a whole book. And sometimes you see books like that where they have to put in filler because it doesn't fill it. And again, for us, the lucky break was the War Diary of Eric Verdun, where we can alternate chapters telling what's happening on board the U-boat and what's happening with the Downs family. So I thought I'd tell you very briefly a little bit about what the family is going through with their survival story. I won't give it all away, but, and people sometimes say, oh, you tell the whole story, you're giving the book away. I go, no, that, you know, in 50 minutes of talking, you can only just scratch the surface. So, for example, with Ina, she's all alone in the ocean. She does have a life jacket on, is getting oil in her eyes from the sinking Heredia. And she makes it to dawn. She's thinking her family is dead. You know, the heartache she's going through is awful. By the way, we were able to find, we had letters from Ina about this event, but of course she'd passed away when we were doing the research. But by, you know, being so persistent and actually kind of bugging family members, we finally found a distant niece who said, yeah, I have an audio tape labeled Ina. I'm like, what's on it? And she goes, I don't know, I've never listened to it. I'm like, listen to it and call us back. And she calls us back and she said, it's Ina talking about this experience in the ocean. So it was like hitting the lottery. And Ina says, you know, dawn came and I see a couple sailors in the distance holding on or riding on top of some wood, you know, some debris from the ship. She says, I go over and she says, one of them is stark naked, so he slides into the water. Now she's hypothermic, she wants to get up on the debris as well, and she does, and she says to him, get up here, this is no time for modesty. And he goes, no ma'am, I'll just stay in the water, and he's clinging onto the board. And she said, by like 9 a.m., this poor sailor is shaking and he's blue, and she doesn't know what she's got to do to get him to get out of the water, because water will suck away your body heat 25 times faster than the air. So, you know, if you're ever in a jam, you always want to get out of the water. If you have clothing on, leave it on. It can trap moisture inside. There's all these little techniques. If you're carrying a few extra pounds, keep them. Don't work them off. People that have extra pounds always survive longer than thin people in the water for extended period of times. So she wants to save this sailor's life, and she goes, all right, if you don't get up on this board, I'm going to swim away, and, you know, figure I'll call his bluff. And he goes, no, ma'am, and he's still blue. And what does she do? She swims away. I mean, who would do that? Who would leave something where other people are and that's floating? But to save this guy's life, she figures, I've got to swim away. She doesn't particularly care about herself because she thinks her family's probably gone as well. And so she goes off on the ocean and spends into the next evening all alone. She was a deeply religious woman. She said, never swore ever in my life until the sharks came. And she said they were coming closer and closer in circles. It said they were about 6-footers. And she claims what saved her life, besides her faith, was that at the last minute she put a heavy overcoat on that went all the way down to her knees. And she said when one shark got aggressive and actually bumped her, and this is frequent, all these survivors I interview, they say sharks usually will bump you or bump your life raft. They're kind of testing, see is there anything alive in it. She said, well, when it bumped me, instead of it feeling my legs or skin, she said I was able to pull my legs up inside of this big overcoat, and the sharks eventually left. And she attributes her faith in the overcoat to her survival. Now, Lucille gets very lucky because her salvation comes by the way of the second mate on board the Heredia named Roy Sorley. That's Roy on the far right, and there he is in this picture with the two men. Roy's on the right. And Roy sees Lucille on the ship. She's been separated from her family, and he says to her, we have to jump off. The ship's going down. It'll suck us to the bottom of the ocean. You've just got to trust me. And she does. And he goes, on the count of 3, we're jumping, and they jump. And then they get in the water, and he says, swim as fast as you can away. And they're swimming, and she keeps stopping. And he goes, why are you stopping? And she goes, my britches keep falling down, because she's in her pajama bottoms. And he's like, just swim. And through the next 18 hours, this man was remarkable, doing whatever he could to keep her alive. Like he found a hatch cover, and he'd put her sitting up on it. So, you know, from her waist down would be submerged, but her waist up would be out of the water. And he'd be in the water holding on next to it, being stung by jellyfish, never telling her. When he got out of the water, he was just a massive, big welts. But basically keeping her spirits up and keeping her going. And when the sharks come, Roy obviously can see the sharks because they're right below him. They'll scoop below these people. But Lucille doesn't see them. And then one time, a shark brushes up against her feet, which again, they're dangling in the water. She goes, "Mr. Sorley, quit tickling my feet." And he doesn't want to panic her, so he goes, "Well, how about if you let me tickle your feet once an hour, in case aircraft comes? We want to be able to signal them." And she's like, "Okay." And she never knew that the sharks had come until they were both rescued. So Roy went on to get I always forget the name, the Mariners something medal, but the highest honor in the Merchant Marines for saving Lucille's life. And it was a real joy when the book came out. We were able to find Roy's son, who said, "My dad never talked about this, but on the mantle was that medal." And we were able to connect him in person with Sonny Downs, who was now 83. And so Sonny was able to thank him for for his dad saving his sister's life. The family makes it. And I'll tell you just very briefly about Sonny's adventure, if you want to call it that. He's on his own. He does find his way back to the ship. He gets up to the top of the uppermost deck where the deck guns were, and who's there but the captain, still in his dress whites, trying to free a life raft, can't get it free, and there's another man trying to get it free. And Sonny said they were struggling and struggling, couldn't get it free, and then he said, a window kicked out from below us, because he said the ship was at a steep angle. Oh, and I forgot to mention this. He said, incredibly, it was like daylight. I'm like, what do you mean? He said the U-boat was right there with its floodlight on us. I said, did they talk to you, like how shots would? He said, no. He said, we couldn't see anybody, no words were exchanged. But he said it was just there with the floodlight. And he said, then kicking up from a broken window comes a man, and he goes towards this deck where these three individuals are, and he can't believe it. It's his father. And what happens next continues to happen. The father and the captain start arguing. The first argument comes about when first the dad says, what are you doing? You got to get away from the ship. And the captain goes, we can't get the life raft free. And the dad goes, get out of the way, you jackass. And in one heave, he gets it up. And then the dad, who's kind of taking over now in the captain's place, and the dad goes, okay, we're putting Sonny on it. It's at an angle. We're going to slide him into the water. Then the three of us will jump, and we'll figure out some kind of position. The life raft is nothing more than 4 balsa wood pieces in a square with no middle. So it's like a sandbox. So Captain Colburn goes, well, no, I need to be on the life raft when you push it off with Sonny. And the dad goes, why? And Captain Colburn goes, I can't swim. And the dad goes, well, you're going to learn real fast. Because my boy's staying on that when we slide it off. And that's just the start. You'll see in the book of many disagreements where you wonder, are they going to make it, or are these guys going to continue to fight? But the dad, it's kind of a reversal of roles. The dad has kind of taken over control of the life raft and pushed the captain aside. At least he didn't push him over. He threatens that many times. So they make it, and the sinking date was May 18th, and it may be hard for you to see up top. This date is May 25th. That's because the Navy had a censorship of about a week to get the full story from the people and not release this news for fear it might give the Germans some advantage. So oftentimes the public was ignorant of what was happening out at sea. Other times they could see it right from the shoreline. This area here had so many U-boats prowling the shoreline and sinking ships, especially off Cape Hatteras a little bit to the south. And we love this picture so much, we tracked down the original. It's just a beautiful family picture. Ina's got the patch on her eye because the oil from the sinking ship. And it's just a great family portrait because they're so happy. Each one had thought the others had perished. But in part 3 of the book, you'll see that those smiles soon fade because they realize they've lost everything. All the money they made in South America, every bit of clothing, even their old car was on the ship. So they went down there poor, and now they're coming back poorer. And the dad gets it into his mind that he wants revenge. So first he tries to join the Marines, and even though he was in great shape, they said, no, you're too old. So he joins the Coast Guard, and he gets on anti-submarine patrol, pulls his whole family up from, they're just getting back into life in San Antonio, and pulls them up and relocates them with the Coast Guard down to St. Augustine, Florida. And you'll see it's really tough on Ina. The kids manage pretty well, but for Ina, it's really tough. She's gone through this terrible experience. And the dad is going through post-traumatic stress syndrome. Even though he's cool, calm, and collected in the survival story you'll read, later he has debilitating nightmares, and they think it affected his life. But what does Eric Verdun do? He's got to get out of there. He's used up his last torpedo. He's got to get back to Lorient, France, but on the way he sinks 3 more ships. Well, how does he do that if he doesn't have torpedoes? He does it in broad daylight in 2 cases, and another case at night, with his artillery guns mounted on that upper deck. And so he's had quite a successful run, and when he returns to France, is awarded the Knight's Cross, as is Harrow Schatz, who has an equally successful run. So they go back to Lorient, France. He gets his 2 weeks off, treated like a hero, but sent right back out to sea. Little do they know that the turning point is coming real fast. The casualty rate of U-boat men was 75%, never lived through the war, and the rate for the commanders was even a higher death rate. And another bonus for Alice and I in writing the book was that Schatz and Verdun, the 2 guys we really focus on, become involved in the strangest World War incident I've ever read about, called the Laconia Affair. And what happens is a British ship, the Laconia, a giant ship, 3,000 people on board, filled with both British passengers and Italian POWs down below, is coming back, I think it was off Spain, and a U-boat puts 2 torpedoes in it and sinks the ship. Well, the captain of that U-boat, his name was Hartenstein, he hears cries for help, but they're in Italian, and he realizes, oh my God, our allies were on board, thinking probably POWs, and gets the message to Downes and say, I'd like to rescue them. He says, but I don't have time to figure out who's Italian, who's British. People are dying right in front of us. Downes gives them permission, rescue as many as you can. So Hartenstein puts out the call over open airways, exposing himself, saying if there's any more U-boats in the area, I'm declaring this a neutral area, humanitarian effort. I need help to rescue these people. So who shows up but the only 2 U-boats in the area, Eric Verdun and Harrow Schatz. And so they just start loading survivors on their U-boats. In some cases, they're pulling up the whole lifeboats of survivors from the Laconia and bringing it right on board the U-boat. Eric Verdun's War Diaries says there were British women and children, and he said we would give them blankets and tea, and he said our crew, these were his exact words, he said our crew became very homesick. And then he went on to say, because these women and children reminded us of our families. And he said it was a tough experience for all of us, tough to keep the morale up, but he said we packed the U-boat with as many people as we could get on board. And so did Harrow Schatz. This is Verdun U-boat, by the way, just packed with people. Hartenstein's U-boat, the same thing. And then inexplicably, a Liberator comes over, and the U-boats are now separated by maybe a mile apart each as they're searching for survivors. The Liberator comes over Hartenstein's U-boat. They see there's people on the deck. They even see a Red Cross. They radio back for instructions what to do, and their instructions come back, bomb it. And so they drop depth charges, and many of these survivors are killed in that attack. We could never get to the bottom of why were their instructions bomb it when they knew that there were survivors on board. But it was only that one brief run, it was only that one bombing, and then Hartenstein had to dive, of course, before he was sunk. And when he came back up, he could only get half the number of people because the others had perished. Whereas Verdun said, I was never bombed. He said eventually a ship, I think it was from Vichy, France, came, and we were able to offload these survivors. So it was just this remarkable tale of his discussions with the British women that were on board. And, you know, they let them go down into the U-boat to get warm. His fourth patrol, things aren't going well. He's out there 143 days, all the way to the tip of South Africa, and he only sinks 2 ships compared to 10 in the Gulf of Mexico on just a 2-week patrol. So we, the Allies, have gotten much better. We're using blimps to spot U-boats when they surface. We're traveling in convoys. Our radar is better, our sonar is better on board the ships. Radar can now pierce cloud cover. So even when the U-boats surface at night, they're not entirely safe. So the whole U-boat war has shifted now in our favor. And the most effective weapon for us was the Liberator. The pilots now had the experience to drop those depth charges, you know, right on the U-boat. You needed it to land either on the U-boat or, you know, within 10 feet to cause a fracture in it, and the U-boat would sink to the bottom of the ocean, and no one ever knew what really happened in those final minutes on board the U-boat. But for U-506, commanded by Erich Verdun, we do know what happened. And again, total luck that this happened with our main character. We didn't know this when we took on the project. He was doing his final patrol. He was only 6 days into it, off Spain and Portugal, when they had some mechanical issues and had to surface in daylight. Didn't want to, but had to. And the way the Liberator attacked was it came out of the sun. So, you know, say I'm up on the upper deck, I'd have binoculars making sure no aircraft were in the area. If the plane is coming out of the sun, it'd be hard to see because the sunlight would be dazzling you. And that's exactly what happened. The Liberator came out of the sun and swooped down on 506. And this is the exact picture of the moment it's first bombed. We would have never found this on our own. We got very lucky. We found a U-boat expert. In the acknowledgments, we really sang his praise. Without him, we could not have done the book. His name is Jerry Mason, and he runs the website called ubootarchive.com. Absolutely instrumental in helping us with the book. And it was an American pilot. His last name was Salm. And normally, again, the U-boat would sink and we wouldn't know what happened. But in this case, because it was daylight and there were men up there with binoculars, there were 5 men on the upper deck, and Erich Verdun was either on the upper conning tower or in the conning tower and was able to get out. And so that when the U-boat sank, those 6 men were in the ocean. And in this picture, it's very hard for you to see, but in the oil slick in the upper right, there's these little black dots, and those are the men. And in one group is 2 sailors on either side of Verdun Minh holding him up because he's injured. And they're all waves, and they're trying to keep his head above water, and they're struggling, and they're coughing and choking on the seawater. And finally, we know Eric Verdun Minh's last words. He looks at one of the men, and he goes, "You two, let me go, let me go." And they have to, because they're drowning too, and they let him go, and Verdun Minh disappears. And the reason we know that is those 2 men that were holding him up are later rescued by a British destroyer, taken to Great Britain, interrogated, and their interrogation report was in the British National Archives. So they described the last hours on the U-boat and what Verdun Minh said and what that last patrol was like, how morale was so low because they would hear about fellow U-boats being sunk. Harrow Schatz's was sunk off Brazil. So Verdun Minh, lost one of his buddies. And, they could see the handwriting on the wall, but they never stepped back from their duty. So, while we never came to like these German enemies, we certainly came to respect them by seeing into their lives and seeing that they're just young men fighting for their country, not necessarily Nazis, no different than people here fighting for your country, and at such a young age. Most of the crew, by the way, was from age 18 to 22, so Verdun Minh was the old man of the crew at age 28. The epilogue, we talk about, the Nuremberg trial, how some of our own admirals spoke up in Dönitz's defense that he should not be hung. He was not a war criminal. He told his men not to strafe the people in the water. And we talk about, well, what became of the Downes family after the father got this crazy mission to, get revenge, and nothing was going to stop him. Well, the good news was little Sonny Downs grows up to be 6'5" and becomes the all-time leading scorer at Texas University in Austin. And then he gets drafted into the NBA. And it's a remarkable story. And he went through all of training camp, and he said, just before the first game, I decided they weren't paying me enough, so I quit. I said, in the NBA? He goes, Mike, back then they barely paid anything. But he had these wonderful stories about playing against Bill Russell in college. And Ray's claim to fame is he could shoot with both hands. And he said, the only person who could defend me was Bill Russell. And I said, why? Was it because he was so strong? And he said, no. He said, Bill Russell was as quick as a cat. So that's to get you excited for the game tonight. And here's Sonny today, and we dedicated the book to him. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I thought we'll have time for 3 questions, and then I'll be doing a book signing with Allison out front, and we can take more after that. But if anybody has a question that I didn't answer, if we get stumped, maybe some in the audience can help us.
I've got one.
Yep, one in the back. I'll repeat it up front here.
Okay.
She had an overcoat that she could put on to fend off the shark. Why didn't she give the overcoat to the native sailor?
That's a great question. Honest to God, I don't have the answer. Yeah, because she would have had the, life vest, which were cork, around that overcoat. She could have taken that off and given it to him. If there's another world, see, I'm going to get all these questions answered and finally have the complete story. Yes?
My uncle was on the German side on a submarine patrolling between New York and Philadelphia. His boat was hit by depth charges, and by the time they crawled back to Lorient, they were 21 days overdue and were given up.
Wow.
Well, later on, he got onto a second boat, and that didn't make it. It was sunk just off the Cape of Spain.
Yes. Yeah, you know, towards the latter part of the war, they couldn't even get out of the Bay of Biscayne from Lorient. They were sunk right there, you know, the RF was waiting.
It was 3 days after Dönitz called them all back. He called them back on the 23rd of May, and that boat was sunk on the 26th.
Yeah, there's two sides to tell, and that's what we really hoped to do with the book. And the War Diaries bring it to life.
I wrote a book about that.
Thank you. One last question.
The diaries that you were speaking about, did they turn them in after every mission? And
Yes.
that's why they were all there?
Right, because otherwise, you know, on that final mission, if the men didn't survive, because the diary did go down with the U-boat, but because they turned them in, we were able to find all three of Verdun Mann's War Diaries before the last patrol. I'll turn it back to Mark.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming out tonight.